I hope you're still all energized and ready to engage as we are going to now delve deeper into a session examining the pivotal role of businesses in the green transition. Setting the scene for this discussion is Erik Dahlhausen, co-founder of Transition Catalyst.
I'm Erik Dahlhausen. I'm a physicist, a petroleum engineer, CCS specialist, a climate activist, and a few other things based in Aberdeen. I want to highlight some important aspects of the big picture that we find ourselves in relating to the role of business. I have 10 minutes and I have 5 topics to cover, so there's a lot to take in. So please stay with me. I will illustrate the climate urgency. I will show 2 perspectives of the actual problem. I'll show how we get things done and sometimes don't. And then discuss the interaction of people, government, and business. Climate change is all about greenhouse gas emissions. You all know that. And there's a few other crises too that need our attention. This graph shows the trend of global greenhouse gas emissions. It'll be familiar to many of you. The first date of interest here is 1987, when climate change became accepted as a big global issue. In 1987, we had a carbon budget. That's the total amount of emissions we can dump into the atmosphere before things get truly out of hand. To honor this carbon budget, the world would need to gently reduce emissions back to zero over a period of 100 to 150 years. Our next stop is in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was written. This was a few years after I got professionally involved with carbon capture and storage, and because of this, became really concerned about climate change and about the government's inaction. By 2015, we'd burned up so much of our carbon budget that instead of it lasting 150 years, we had barely 35 years left. This is where the 2050 net zero endpoint came in. Now we're in 2024, and not only have we, since the Paris Agreement, burned that extra little kind of brownish, grayish triangle at the top, but we've also committed ourselves to that big magenta triangle just because we haven't reduced our emissions yet. And that has taken our emissions endpoint much further in. We still pretend that 2050 is fine, but our remaining carbon budget won't last that long. Of course, world wars have been fought and won and lost in less time than we have left now. So with the right live or die attitude, we still do this. But we really need that attitude. It's really urgent. The problem grows because of business as usual. And then in 2019, Extinction Rebellion protests forced the UK government to take this threat seriously. And that had an important result. The UK government declared an environment and climate emergency. So what we got was business as usual with a danger sign stuck on it. And we also got a kind of notional national target, which was net zero by 2050. Now, let's look at this from a few different perspectives. This is how the government makes sense of society and how the government has looked at this problem for a long time. This is confusing and not very helpful. And thankfully, over the last few years, another perspective is becoming a little bit more prevalent. But the government is still organized in this way, and that really doesn't help. But let's look differently. What was the source of the problem again? That really looks far simpler The red bit is fossil fuels, and the rest is everything else. It's too simple to work with practically, but it's really important to remember that fossil fuels are at the root of the problem. In the last few years, a more useful perspective has come out, which is this. It's emissions by sector, but these sectors are large sectors with a very strong common thread. Simply said, there are three big chunks which make up more than 3/4 of the whole problem in the UK. Transport, buildings, both domestic and business, and energy supply. Note that industry, which gets a lot of government attention, in the UK is only that tiny sliver on the top right. Now a little story on how we get things done. This is not just for business and industry. This is also in emergency and war situations. This is what works, and it's pretty much the only thing that does. It's the hierarchy of vision, strategy, and policy. I put vision at the bottom because it's the all-important foundation. With a shared, clear vision, you can design effective strategies. With effective strategies, you can develop valid policies. And only valid policies can change the outcomes for the better. Vision is not some business prop. Business is the shared goal that we head for. And to hark back to it's the difference between the C40 negotiations that were mentioned earlier, where everybody has the same goal, and the COP, where everybody's trying to defend themselves. The thing is, when you cannot force the people you work with to do as they're told, they all need to share the same intent. The government works differently. That's why we call them policymakers, not vision developers or strategists. Governments make policy, partly based on what resulting actions they like or what their advisors want, and partly based on very little, as far as I can tell. Governments do have a kind of vision. At the moment, it's net zero by 2050. But because everyone has a different idea of what that means, it's really more of a decoration. The government also writes strategy papers, and I can't call them strategies because the ones I've read aren't. In particular, the energy strategy is an ill-informed and misguided document, written to deliver fossil fuels and not energy at all. It's appalling and utterly useless. And recently, I've read the heat in building strategy, and that is of a similar quality. What we need first to get us out of this urgent and dangerous situation is a relatable vision. Net zero by 2050 doesn't hack it. To make it relatable, it has to relate to a sector. Remember energy, transport, buildings? Let's have a look at some already existing visions which just have never made it to the government's emergency vision department. Maybe there isn't one. For an energy vision, try to imagine all energy renewable with distributed generation and storage. Sufficient storage for supply stability. Controlled, affordable prices, less pollution, better health. Can you picture that? Can you picture that better than net zero by 2050? Let's try transport. The transport vision could be green public transport for all. For long distance, electrified rail. For short distance, electrified anything. Cycle, walk as a preferred choice. Can you picture that? Can you picture that better than net zero by 2050? for buildings. The vision could be for existing buildings, comfortable, healthy, affordable, and in use. For new build, low carbon materials, self-energy generating. Can you picture that? Can you picture that better than net zero by 2050? Next, we'll look at the three main players in the human and political world: people, government, and business. Government is selected by the people to look after their interests. Modern economic interaction was designed with a regulatory fence to protect people and government from the excess of capitalist business. Adam Smith discussed the critical importance of this boundary at great length. Of course, what we have now in the UK and much of our globalized world is that the legislative boundary has moved to protect government and business from the people. The little flame highlights businesses which cause climate change in order to stay in business. The rest are just businesses. Some of the largest ones are highly focused on extracting the largest amount of cash from the largest number of people. But most other businesses are there to supply people with things that they need, and they are run by people who do the best they can. Climate change hits people first. And so the UK government is now actually strengthening the legislative wall between people and government, criminalizing peaceful protest, jailing the messengers, defending inaction in the face of emergency. And there lies an opportunity for business to make the change. They have more influence on policy than people do, and they seem to be better at getting things done than the government is. There's another thing which negatively influences people and governments alike, and which may have slightly less effect on business. And that's propaganda. The public discourse is controlled by the few. And that is the setting in which businesses must play their part. So what can businesses do? Here's some thoughts just to seed the conversation that we're about to have. Businesses can change their mission away from maximizing cash extraction. They can change their products and services to zero emissions. And I say zero, not net zero, I say zero, because that's the end point. They can change the supply chain and materials to zero emissions. Importantly, businesses can influence the government to do far, far better. They can use public relations and advertising to change the public discourse. They can honestly evaluate their own life cycle emissions. And they can be transparent about what they do, and so call out greenwashing. And businesses can help other business to do the same. To summarize, we looked at how the urgency is growing exponentially. We looked at the root cause and how perspective matters when you want to do something. We looked at the importance of a relatable vision. We looked at the interplay between people, government, and business, and the opportunity this creates for businesses to shine. And we looked at what businesses might do before and after governments decide to finally take this crisis seriously. In the next panel, let's listen to some of these green businesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for laying the groundwork for our conversation. Please do stay with us, as I'm sure during the Q&A session we're going to have questions from the audience for you. But now let's welcome our distinguished panelists to join us here on the stage for the conversation. Milan van der Meulen, founder of Soli. Eleni Polychroniadou, co-founder of Centauri. Buffy Price, co-founder of Carbon Re, and Simon Hepner, co-founder of Net Zero Now. Well, welcome to all of you. I love these little green rings. It sort of like helps us identify one another. And I wasn't aware that you were one of us.
I'm one of you.
I know, that's fantastic. Buffy, we're going to start with you. I'm going backwards on the slides.
That was why I'm not in the Green Circle Club.
I know.
Didn't join this club.
That's why we just.
Okay. Yeah.
But you have the UCL badge, so that's just as good. I'm very much interested in the personal stories. We always talk about it. For me personally, the personal stories are the most important part, and that's how I connect with the different stories. We have a panel of wonderful business people here, and I'm very keen on knowing their personal stories. So, Buffy, what motivated you to focus your career on developing solutions for the climate crisis?
Well, it's a relatively recent transition. Interesting, all the points you raised, Eric, about working in policy. I'd previously worked in as a political researcher and working with NGOs, and a lot of the work that we were doing was really focused on highlighting where there are issues and monitoring and reporting. Latterly, I started working with artificial intelligence and satellite data, again using the opportunities with artificial intelligence and satellite data to highlight the magnitude of deforestation in the Amazon, for example. But what we were really doing was providing that information. We know that that problem was there. We were providing the information to policymakers, to decision makers to do something. And it sort of felt like it was going into a bit of a void. And that frustration, we know where the challenges are, and I really wanted to do something directly about that. So, I mean, not to say that monitoring, reporting, and accountability are really, really important. We must do that. But frequently, I found it was a bit of an excuse. We can't do anything until we've got the data, until we understand the landscape. So, protect us as an industry. And I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Daniel Sommerbell. So we're a spin out of UCL and Cambridge University. And Dan had done his PhD research at the Institute for Manufacturing at Cambridge University, and he'd identified that in cement production, which accounts for 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions, there is a 20% difference between a good day and a bad day in the process. So even within the existing envelope, there is a huge room for opportunity to reducing the amount of fossil fuels that have been burning on any given day. He was doing this sort of analog. He was doing this as a continuous improvement expert, and combining his expertise with artificial intelligence. We know that there is something that we can do today to have direct reduction in CO2 emissions in the cement industry, and hopefully more wider. So the motivation was to have a direct impact, and also very much it was existential crisis. I think we've heard a lot about it this morning, the frustrations of seeing there's so much to be done and wanting to have a role in that.
And I mean, I'm looking at you guys, and I know that it is possible. We have all the solutions, and I think you're the great proof of that. Milan, 10 years of Soli, and I was fortunate enough to be celebrating with you the 10th anniversary of Soli. Could you share with us the journey of founding Soli and how it aligns with your mission of providing solar energy access for all?
Yeah, sure. So 10 years in the solar industry, and although we deliver green energy, if you look to my hairs, you will already see some gray touch points on that as well. Because indeed, it is a very dynamic market. And to be honest, it's also for me always interesting to be in this academic playing field again. Because I once thought, how am I going to make an impact in that topic of climate change? Because when I was 13, I watched the documentary of Al Gore, An Inconvenient Truth. Frankly, my father forced me and my brother to watch it. And then not only once, but weekends and weekends after that. Later on, we decided to call it green doctrination. But we saw a problem that was so big and so important that at that time, although very young at age, we decided to as soon as we start our careers, we need to contribute to the solution of it. And then we were at the point to think about how can we make impact. And of course, you can strive to become active in politics. But yeah, then you have to wait quite some time to make a career out of yourself and to get yourself at the space where you can really press buttons. So we decided to use entrepreneurship and founded Soli to make solar energy accessible. Back indeed more than 10 years ago already. And right now it's quite a well-known service, but back then it was a completely new product. And to be honest, now active indeed in this industry for 10 years, active in throughout Europe, even in Africa, it is a hell of a ride, but I think it also shows indeed the importance of entrepreneurship, because you can put politicians and scientists in a room and then you will have the most wonderful discussions, but as soon as they leave the room, then the problem is still there. You need to have a strong level of execution power to really solve it. And I think entrepreneurship sometimes is a little bit underestimated, but I think they are the vital condition to really overcome this big crisis.
Absolutely, and so I'm going to pick up on that, the entrepreneurship, and Eleni, Director of the Year for the Young and Startup category. I mean, that's amazing. Many congratulations. Your career spans entrepreneurship, business, climate activism. Could you share with us your personal story and journey, and what inspired you to combine all these amazing areas into what it is now, Santali?
So I will echo actually both of my panelists. I think it's actually really interesting to have all of us share our stories because there's so many common themes. But I always cared about making an impact and sort of looked at inequality and poverty and climate change and just felt overwhelmed by how many problems there are in the world, and was constantly trying to figure out how to best make an impact. So similarly, I sort of said, okay, best way to make an impact, become a policymaker, be in the COP negotiations as a climate chief negotiator and make that final decision that kind of has a domino effect. And then sort of looking into that career path a little bit more, realized I'm not a very patient person and it takes a lot of patience and compromise and many, many, many years to be able to make some of the policy changes that we see. And they are important and they do have a domino effect, but it's very difficult, I think, for someone like myself who needs to see tangible results, and I'm what I would classify as a doer. So I sort of did a degree in environmental policy and then parked the idea and tried to see potentially how I could work in business. And actually, even in business, I started feeling frustrated because I felt like big corporates weren't taking things seriously and there was a lot of talk and not a lot of walk. So I spent a lot of my evenings doing climate activism, Extinction Rebellion, climate reality, lobbying my local government, trying to make change, trying to find the path that felt the most tangible. I didn't intend on becoming an entrepreneur, to be honest. I was terrified of the notion, and an opportunity arose when my colleague at the time and I were sitting in a business that got acquired. We got acquired by a company that didn't believe that oil and gas didn't have a future, and they didn't believe that oil and gas would need to be transitioned out, and this was a company that bought a sustainability company. So my colleague and I sort of looked at each other and went, how on earth are we ever going to work for people that don't believe in something so basic as the fossil fuel transition? And so decided to pull together and start a business. And it's been incredibly rewarding because of the ability to take ownership and agency and really figure out how can you make the best impact, and also not only the impact that you make as yourself, but really looking at your sphere of influence and thinking about your partners, your collaborators, the people around you, because outside of what we do on a day-to-day basis, even by sharing our experiences with our friends, our families, our network, there is a domino effect across the board, and I think that's been one of the most powerful experiences of entrepreneurship for me.
Very inspiring. Simon, Net Zero Now, my newly discovered climate reactor leader. What led you to dedicate your career to sustainable business practices?
Well, for me, back in the late 80s, I studied environmental economics and loved it. I thought, this is it, this is what I want to do. And so I left university and promptly did something completely different. And I spent the next decade meandering through lots of different jobs until I found myself in East Timor, working with the UN in 1999 in this kind of state building exercise for East Timor, which was a newly christened state. And I was very excited about this. This was, a blank piece of paper. How do we create a new country and what do we build it on? But it very quickly transpired that the whole economic theory of East Timor was going to be built on fossil fuels. It was about fossil fuel extraction from the Timor Gap. And that just felt incredibly backward-looking to me. This was the UN, with everything that they know, creating a new nation and not being able to get past the paradigm of a fossil fuel economy. And that reignited my interest for environmental action. And as everyone here has said, we all have to choose what vehicle we're going to drive in order to deliver on those passions that we've got. Is it going to be academia? Is it going to be politics, activism, innovation, entrepreneurial? And for me, it was business. And specifically, how do we convince businesses that operating with less environmental impact and more social value will help make them more successful businesses? That's been proved time and time again. And if we can convince businesses of that, then we've got a chance to sit down with them and talk about what that means for them. How can we actually deliver on that? And that's what I've spent the last 20 years doing, convincing businesses that this is going to be something that works for them as a business, and then helping them deliver it. And a lot of that's been around climate strategy. And again, just to echo the point you were making, it's incredibly satisfying because day by day, you're seeing the change of what you're trying to do, rather than this kind of spending years and years working on a piece of policy that may or may not get passed, may or may not have an impact. This is day by day, working with businesses, getting them to change and seeing that incremental improvement. And it's really satisfying.
It is a crucial part of our society. So if we can make those changes there in the business sector, we're sort of like 1/3 of the way through that direction. Buffy, as the co-founder of Carbon Re, there's been a lot of excitements and concerns around AI, but I usually like to look at the excitements and all the positives. How your AI and climate tech startup is helping manufacturers to go net zero?
Right, so as I mentioned previously, cement industry accounts for 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The foundation industries globally account for about 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's extraordinary, a huge amount. And we're talking cement, steel, glass, ceramics, all the fundamental materials that we need for modern life. 40% of the emissions from cement production come from burning fossil fuels. We heard a lot about fossil fuels this morning. And as I mentioned, there is that 20% variation. There's an opportunity to, without changing anything, no installation of hardware, just installing our AI algorithms, feeding those directly into a distributed control center, modelling the environment of what's going on in this really, really volatile environment, the high heat part, the cement production, about 15,000 degrees, this continuous process, constantly burning fossil fuels. And we're teaching our algorithms the principles of physics and chemistry. They've got all this sensor data. As I mentioned, it's really, really highly volatile, so they need to be monitoring what's going on. But we don't really understand what is happening in that process in any given moment. What's really driving the transformation of that raw material, limestone, as it's heating up and moving through the process. We're talking mostly fossil fuels, but we're beginning to see the more introduction of alternative fuels, which is a fantastic thing, moving away from the fossil fuel use. But that drives more volatility into that process. There's different densities of fuels. One day it might be burning sort of biomass, next it's domestic waste, it's monkey nut seeds, it's whole truck tires sometimes. So this is driving a whole lot of complexity into the system. So what we're able to do with our models is predict what's going on in that environment and make adjustments to the set points at any given time to optimize the amount of fossil fuels that they're burning or alternative fuels as well. So this has never been done before, but the industry is actually very well prepared with this data and they haven't adopted these technologies. So we're sort of the forerunners in there. And we're seeing at the moment with our models sort of 2% reduction. We're definitely going to push that up to about 5% later this year. We see opportunities to reduce further up to about 15%. At the moment, so a 5% reduction in a single plant using our technology in a year, that'd be equivalent of taking 11,000 cars off the road. So it's really, really impactful. And actually just with the pilots that we've been running, the early trials, I think we've saved the equivalent of about 900 to 1,000 people's entire lifetimes of CO2 emissions, and that's just from our prototype. So the opportunity is huge. So yeah, very excited.
A very noticeable number there. Yeah, that's amazing. Milan, you touched on the importance of entrepreneurship, but let's talk about it. As a pioneer in the solar energy sector, what role do you believe that entrepreneurship plays in driving the green transition?
Yeah, extremely important. So let me enter the solar bubble a bit. Because in the EU we made the Green Deal, right? I'm sure it also entered England in terms of news. And if you follow the goals we have set in the Green Deal, and let's incorporate England in this, because you're still in our hearts, we need to put solar panels on 40,000 homes a day. That's the challenge. So imagine that. It's a big challenge. And when we started 10 years ago, the topic was all about, do we need to change, right? Is climate change a very important topic? Are the solutions at hand? But I think we now really entered the phase that we just need to go plain in execution mode. The technologies are already there. International Energy Agency already said that all the technologies are there to cut emissions by 50% in 2030, just with the current technologies. And of course, we need to do further research and find out new technologies. But right now, we are just at the phase of execution. And I think we've also entered the phase wherein entrepreneurial part is therefore the most important condition to make that a success. So I hope that answers the question.
Fantastic. Yes. Eleni, there's been a lot of talks and again concerns around the topic of greenwashing and now with the new regulations, the EU regulations. I know that you focus on verifying environmental claims and combating greenwashing. Could you elaborate on the importance of ensuring credibility and transparency in sustainability initiatives?
Absolutely. I mean, how many times has someone read a news article that says government commits to a specific target, or UK, for example, has reduced its emissions by 50% compared to the target, or big company stands up and says we have the greenest product on the market. Okay, and how do we know that? How can we prove that? How can we trust that claim is true? Now, I don't want to be cynical, but we do hear a lot of things that aren't 100% accurate. Anyone that's worked in statistics and data knows that the data can be the data, but you can make it say certain things, or you can tweak certain variables or put certain assumptions in, and all of a sudden you've got the answer that you want. And with some good marketing and advertising, everyone's going to sit there and believe it. With the climate crisis, with the extent of the urgency that we have to know if we're actually making progress, and we have to know that we're really starting to move the needle. Otherwise, we're all going to be standing here in 2050 and wondering what on earth happened and how on earth are we living in this world when we thought that we were making much more progress than we actually did. Al Gore recently launched the Climate Trace Initiative, which was very much focused around the verification and traceability of all of these greenhouse gas emissions. My company is focused on the built environment, so we've heard a little bit about buildings, we've heard about cement, which is a huge portion of a building construction. Buildings account for 40% of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, and there's a lot of people that say, yes, we have green buildings. So we're really focused on making sure that when somebody says that their building is zero carbon or lower carbon or is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, there's a certain level of verification and trust. But that applies to everything, because as consumers, as citizens, as active, engaged citizens in our government and policy, we need to know what's going on and actually whether certain policies and decisions being made or certain products are actually changing things or not, so we can all make more informed decisions.
Thank you, Eleni. Simon, as a co-founder of Net Zero Now, could you explain how your organization provides a sector-specific solution for businesses to achieve that net zero that we're talking about today?
Sure. So Net Zero Now, we launched 3 or 4 years ago on this premise that while there was some clarity around global guidelines for carbon accounting and target setting, the specificity when you get down to the level of a specific type of business, it makes that difficult. There's lots of room for interpretation in those global guidelines. And so what we end up with is individual businesses interpreting them in their own way, and that means inconsistency, and that leads to the problem you're talking about. And so the result of that is inaction, really. Other businesses are looking around saying, oh, everyone's doing it differently. They're getting called out for the claims that they're making because they're doing it differently. I think we'll just wait. And it feels like a very inefficient and bad way to go about solving this problem. And what we try to do is work with the key players in each sector, the trade associations, the big corporate partners, the media, to collectively answer the questions and create a methodology for businesses in that sector that brings that consistency. It brings the consistency around the calculation and the target setting and the action and the claims that you can make about what you're doing. And that approach is something that we've taken to 9 sectors now. Some very odd ones. We're working in the salon sector. We're working in hospitality, in brewing. That was my choice. And we just started work in the construction sector, actually, with looking at the whole life carbon assessment piece from Bricks and trying to think about how that applies down the supply chain for a plumber. How do they input into the whole life carbon assessment piece? So the sector-based approach seems absolutely essential to us. It brings that consistency, it supports the claims that you're making because there's a consistent methodology, and it also allows for collective action. We can bring businesses together that face the same challenges to see how collectively they can create solutions to those challenges and bring their collective power to bear on that.
So many questions and so little time. I think we are going to open the floor to questions from the audience. And is this the one? One more? Yes, for the questions that we are going to have from our online attendees as well. Any questions here in the audience? And I have forgotten my other iPad backstage. Apologies for that. We can take a question from the audience, and then the gentleman up there.
Hiya. I'm James. Thanks very much for talking, everybody. It's really, really interesting. A lot of you guys are talking about trying to convince people and help people provide the tools to allow people and businesses to make decisions towards making their businesses and their lives more climate conscious and more environmentally friendly. My brother's girlfriend studied environmental sciences, like many people in this room probably, and now she works for Shell. So I went and spoke to her, and I was shocked by the amount of apathy I got from her, and it really demoralized me. And I found myself, despite the fact that I've been kind of working and thinking about sustainability and talking with so many people like yourselves about these sorts of things, that I was totally powerless to respond to her level of apathy. And so I wonder if you could provide some advice for us, how we might talk to our friends, our colleagues, our family, our industry kind of like peers and stuff. How would we talk to them to convince them that there is still hope and not to feel so apathetic about the world because they are part of it? Thank you.
Who would like to? I'm trying to get to the...
Well, I'll
would
jump
like
in.
to
Actually, it's not
While we're sorting the slides out.
Yes, it's not directly answering your question, James. But one of the challenges we had selling into industry is what is their motivation to buy our product? I want to save the planet. I want to make the world a better place. All the cliches. We could be, our Carbon Ray, our mission is to reduce gigatons of CO2 emissions annually. So it's really significant. And then talking to, head of a cement plant, and they're interested in, their bottom line and the quality of the cement and the throughput of the cement, and actually having that dialogue and realising that actually I can win. I don't mind why they're buying a product. If it means that they're saving money on fuels that they're buying, and that's why they're buying it, that's fine, as long as I know that we're having a positive impact. We initially went in trying to target, the chief sustainability officers and people with that kind of remit, and actually finding much more interest from the chief digital officers and CFOs. So it's really interesting understanding what people's motivation are for change, and really quite shocking when, it seems so obvious. I work in a climate tech company, so everybody I know and all my algorithms, and I'm here, and everybody totally agrees with what your point and where you're coming from, right? So it's really shocking when you meet people who just aren't interested. So I think how I've managed it professionally is it doesn't really matter as long as they're going on the same journey. So if I can find a way to connect with them that helps them make better choices, I guess it's a very strong value judgment from me. But if those cement plants are using our technology, it doesn't really matter why. So there's a little bit of a how I deal with it personally. So not a direct answer, but.
And Eric, I think you wanted to pick up on that.
Yeah, I've worked for Shell for just under a decade, and I've worked in oil industry for another 15 years after that, different companies. And I've had many climate change conversations over the last 15 years with my oil colleagues too, while I was in the oil industry. Specifically after the point I mentioned when I started working on carbon storage and started studying climate change, so I was aware of it. But just to make it clear, when you work in an oil company, the information that you get is in the bubble, yeah, and you don't realize that. I realized that when this whole CCS thing, which wasn't out, I'd already left Shell for a while. When that came up, I thought, wow, that's interesting, because just before I joined the oil industry, I joined in 1990, and that was when climate change was just on the agenda. And I remember conversations about this, we've got 100 or 130 years. And I remember those conversations, and the next time climate change cropped up in the conversation was 20 years later. And that's because my circle was the people I worked with. I moved to a different country, you meet different people, but they're all in that circle. So one suggestion I would have is, when you try to change the minds of people in the oil industry, then don't hold your breath, because you might well not succeed. Yeah, because it's really ingrained. On the other side of it, a lot of the conversation I had with my colleagues was focused on concern. And they were actually afraid to bring it up, but I would just talk in the office about climate change. And they would always be happy to discuss this when nobody was around to hear it, because they were concerned that this was going to impact on their work. I've never had any trouble with my work until I became really vocal and got kicked off projects because I'm a bit critical of carbon storage and I know too much. But they were concerned. A bit like, journalists self-censor when they think the editor is going to throw it out. So there's a lot of that going on. And there's one point which I was going to make. Yeah, for me, my main reason for becoming active, and I haven't picked my area yet, so at the moment I'm working in retrofit and trying to get 5,000 homes in Aberdeen retrofitted over the next 15 years, but from the community up instead of from the top down. Which, is completely different from what I normally do. My driver is the system is going to collapse, unless it doesn't. Yeah. If it collapses, it's going to go violent. I have a 13-year-old son and I don't really want him to, I'm training him to deal with violence, but I don't want him to. And that's a really strong motivator for me to have this realization that, I can't say that here, but it's going to go wrong unless it's not. And that's the choice. So for me, that motivates. But a lot of people are frightened when I say, look, it's going to be a revolution, and I don't want it to be violent, because violence, whichever way it goes, violence polarizes and destroys societies.
Simon and Eleni.
I think we have to realize that the motivation for us is going to be very different from the motivation for other people. And my experience of doing this for the last 20 years is that trying to appeal to businesses' sense of what's going to be great for the planet, what's going to be great for society, doesn't resonate. It doesn't convert businesses into the businesses that we can work with. We have to tell them this is going to be good for their business. We have to tell them this is going to make them a more resilient, more successful business that can employ the best people, that can continue to win customers, that can be cost efficient, and then they start to turn onto it. But telling them they have to do this in order to save the planet doesn't work.
Different motivations,
Different
and
motivations.
definitely money talks.
And just one
For
thing
the
to add, because
businesses.
that's the positive thing about someone who works for Shell, is that money talks for them, right? So Shell looks at the world through an Excel sheet, so to say. So they look at numbers. And if you look to the Netherlands, for example, of course Shell is quite dominant in the Netherlands. People think sometimes that Dutch people are very progressive, and sometimes they are, but they mostly think about their own wallet. And we are now champion in the field of solar energy. We have the most solar panels per inhabitant globally. So, and it's not because people wanted to really contribute to this energy transition, it's mostly because they save money. So if I can prove you, and therefore also her, to show them that, for example, having solar panels is saving money, more than a traditional utility contract from a fossil fuel-based utility, for example, that already helps. But of course, what we also see in the Netherlands is that sometimes the success is so big that Shell is now preparing a lawsuit against the government because the phase out of fossil fuels is going faster than they expected. And then faster than they anticipated in their Excel sheets. And then now they want to get compensated for them. And I know it's crazy, but it underlines the fact that we are really winning, that the transition is going faster than all their calculations. And I think that's also something we have to be positive about. So show them the alternatives, because the alternatives we have right now, they speak for themselves in money, in value, and everything. So to make it a little bit more direct and personal.
Eleni.
I have a slightly different opinion from everyone on the panel. I spent the first portion of my career saying, okay, let's not talk about the planet and stuff, let's talk about business, let's talk about money, let's talk about what people relate to. I am moving away from that, actually, and trying to bring the conversation back into that, because I think we have disconnected people from everything. right? We're talking about politics, we're talking about business, and we're talking about people. People work in business, people are politicians, people have businesses, people are making decisions. And yes, there are these veils of politics and corporations, etc., but at the end of the day, if you can talk to someone on a human level and convince them and engage with them in human speak, let's not talk our Excel spreadsheets and our P&Ls and what's that supplier saying, but actually, what do you care about and what matters to you? And how can we then have that domino effect? I think we would get a lot further than when we put on the business hat. And I think it's hard and it's very draining because you do get a lot of pushback and it takes a long time and a lot of personal energy and investment to be able to kind of engage with people on that level. But I think the flip of that, for me personally at least, in the work that we do, is once you get people bought into the vision and the realization that actually they're not powerless and okay, they're one person, but imagine what if scenarios, if every single person in Shell did one action for climate, there's thousands of people in Shell, and Shell has an enormous impact, and you could really move the needle. So empowering people to realize that they have agency and they can make a difference, and making them be the champions within their organizations, for me, that's the way that I'm trying to do business, and I'm trying to move away from covering things up in you're going to save money and it's going to be okay and it's really in your benefit, and trying to get back to the value of why they're doing what they're doing.
Thank you. I'm looking through the questions we have from our online attendees, and it's quite fascinating. There are many questions about mental health, anxiety, and children. I feel that these questions are not as relatable as we would like them to be to our panelists here who are in business. So I would like to take another question, that lady over there in the middle. Thank you. And if you could just make it short, we have less than 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your perspective. I think, Eleni, you may have indirectly answered my question already, but I guess I wanted to ask, all of you have your values that drive your work, and I think the fact that this is an area of business that is evolving and growing is wonderful. But how do you combat the areas where, you know, as you said, in Shell, in that bubble, in that environment, the kind of company ethos is so against change, where business as usual is so entrenched and defended and denial is rife. How do you get change into those organizations? And Simon, maybe this is a question for you, for kind of how you reach out and engage in businesses that are resistant to that, and where, you know, their bottom line and how they make money is still viable, where contributing to the climate crisis is still viable and it's still an attractive choice. How do we make alternatives more attractive, but also how do we make the incumbent less attractive? So it's that last part that I'm interested in. Thank you.
Very quickly. So encouragingly, in the last 6 months to a year, the landscape has started to change, and more businesses are voluntarily coming forward saying we need to have a climate strategy. And that's partly being driven by legislation and regulation requiring businesses to disclose their carbon impact, but partly by stakeholders as well, particularly procurement. There's more and more requirement in tenders that are going out for the businesses that want to bid for that contract to have a carbon reduction plan. That's now in public procurement, and the NHS just came out in November last year saying the threshold for any business that wants to apply to the NHS to have a contract is now £10,000. So that's basically everyone. And that's bringing 50,000 new suppliers into this world where they have to do this in order to continue to do business. That's been very powerful as a motivator. but also their customers. You guys, everyone who spends money with organizations is an agent of that change and is able to have agency and make businesses think that this is important. And after 15 to 20 years of it being a real uphill struggle, the last 12 months have been transformational in a way, in terms of it not being us going out and telling businesses and making the case. They're starting to come to us and say, this is something we need to do. We might not be ideologically aligned with this, hopefully they are, but we know we've got to. And I think we're on that tipping point where it's suddenly going to be every business doing this, every business having a strategy. And that strategy is built on knowing what their carbon footprint is, setting ambitious targets and having a plan to achieve those targets, and then disclosing it transparently. Those are the 4 pillars. Sorry, that wasn't too quick.
No, that's perfect. Eric?
Yeah, just a very short bit, because you mentioned, what can you do, for example, inside a company like Shell, and knowing the inside of these companies very well, I'd say very little. I've tried for many years, but the big issue is that the core of these businesses has to go down the tube. And you will hit that level. So having the conversation with individuals who work there is one thing. That will work, and they can leave and go somewhere else, and most skills are transferable. That's pretty clear. It's a challenge to sell those skills on. But the company itself will not change out of the fossil fuel industry. That's not how it works. That's what they've been pretending for decades, but that is not how business works. That's not even what they're allowed to do unless they get the majority of their shareholders on side to actually change the industry, which they won't. So a business either gets all the shareholders online to actually change what they do as a business, but the core of it is, typically, you would just close up shop and give any residual funds to the shareholders. That's it, end of business. So thinking that you can change companies who make a living out of fossil fuels, I think is, put your energy elsewhere, I'd say.
Well, thank you so much, Milan van der Meulen, Buffy Price, Eleni Polychroniou, Simon Hepner, and Eric Dahlhausen. We have come to the end of our morning sessions. I hope you enjoyed it so far. We all need and deserve a lunch break, and we will see you here in an hour time. Thank you.